the... All right, and I will bring up my screen. Okay, type screen. All right.
Jesus, resurrection. Refuting the resurrection.
So hopefully that's showing up there, part 6.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, this is the final lecture for the series on refuting the resurrection skeptics. So just basically a quick recap. So remember in week 1 we covered what was the meaning of the resurrection, and we found out it was a glorious bodily physical resurrection. Then in the following weeks, we got into the positive case, how we as Christians would prove historically that Jesus rose from the dead. And in the first place, we would look at what are the historical sources we would use. And then next, we would say, what are the historical facts that we can glean from those sources? And then the last couple of weeks, we looked at, well, what are some of the explanations people give for those facts and how do they compare to each other? And we found that the resurrection hypothesis is clearly the best. So, just by way of recap, you can see here are the 6 historical sources that we covered in week 2. And here were the 9 historical facts that we went over in week 3. And then in week 4, we covered these 4 skeptical theories and saw that they were all failures in terms of the criteria. And then last week, we covered 5 hypotheses, and we saw that really the resurrection is the only one that gets green check marks for all the criteria, and therefore it's the best explanation of the facts. So this week, we're kind of switching gears, and we're looking now at the skeptic, because resurrection skeptic, he might say, well, look, I have certain negative evidence. Your positive evidence for the resurrection is great, but I have evidence of my own that disproves that the resurrection hypothesis is true. And we're going to be looking at 4 of the negative evidences that skeptics might appeal to disprove the resurrection and say, no, that actually the resurrection hypothesis is false. It didn't happen. And the first objection, this was something that came up from Reverend Sully during week 2. And you might hear resurrection skeptics try and raise a simple and a simple and undeniable fact that we no longer possess the originals, right? We don't have the Gospel of John as John himself wrote it. That's been lost to history for centuries. Or, we don't have Paul written in his own hand, his letters and stuff like that. There we go. So all we possess today are manuscripts, copies of the originals. And skeptics will say, well, if all we have are later manuscript copies of the originals, the objection is we don't know what the originals actually said. We have no proof that, what the original gospels or the original letters of Paul actually said with respect to the resurrection. So therefore you can't believe in it. And I'm just kind of curious, like how would you guys maybe respond to a skeptic who would raise that and say, look, we have no idea what the originals actually said.
Didn't Paul have somebody writing for him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, he had a scribe.
Yeah.
And in fact, he tells us at certain points he writes in his chicken scratch writing and stuff like that. But yeah, most of the writers would use a scribe or something like that, right? When they're dictating. Paul would dictate orally, and a scribe would write down First Corinthians, what he's saying. So yeah. Okay. Well, here's how I think that we should respond as Christians. And amazingly, this will kind of be incredible because all biblical scholars and historians today, I'm not just talking Christians, but atheists, agnostic, Jewish, whatever, all scholars universally recognized that the New Testament is the most well-attested text in human history with respect to its preservation over the millennia. So scholars engage in this field. It's a scientific field called textual criticism. And basically, they engage in certain tests, like the bibliographical test. That's a fancy word, but that just kind of says, well, it looks at the quantity. How many manuscripts do we have? And in the first place, on that first part, the New Testament has more manuscripts than any other text in human history. So we have a total of 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and over 5,800 of those are written in the original Greek language. So we don't have to worry about translation issues. We know what the original said because we have over 5,800 manuscripts in the original Greek to look at and compare. But there's a second aspect. In addition to the quantity, there also is, well, how early are the manuscripts? How close to the originals are they? Because, maybe you have manuscripts that date 1,000 years afterwards. Well, that's not so great. But with the New Testament, we have very early manuscript attestation, literally dating within 100 to 200 years after Jesus. In fact, our earliest manuscript is something called Papyrus or P52. And here's just an example of some of these old papyrus manuscripts. This is P52. The oldest manuscript comes from the Gospel of John, and it dates to about 100 AD to 125 AD, according to the majority of scholars. So that's literally 70 years to 100 years after Jesus. Incredibly early. And just, by contrast, if we compare this with other ancient literature, we have manuscripts dating, hundreds of years, if not 900, 800 years after the fact. And we only have about a dozen manuscripts for some of the best ancient texts in the world, such as, Herodotus, the first Greek historian in history, or for Julius Caesar or Aristotle. We have about a dozen. Compare that with 25,000 manuscripts. There's no difference. There's a huge difference there. And by comparison, the second best attested to source is Homer's Iliad. So what do we have with that? We at best have 2,000 manuscripts, all dating several centuries, even thousands of years after the fact. So, close to 2,000 years after the fact. So it really is no comparison. That in terms of the bibliographical test, the New Testament passes with flying colors. And I just want to play a couple quick clips from a textual critic and Christian scholar, Daniel Wallace, so he can kind of explain this, how good the evidence is. All right.
We don't have the original manuscripts of the New Testament. They all disappeared within a century, I'm pretty convinced, by copying and copying and copying. Frequent handling. The early church was far more concerned to get the gospel out than they were to do exact copying of the New Testament. And that actually is a blessing, because they didn't have those kinds of controls, and consequently you get copies that are not through just one stream, but tons of people all over the place are making these copies. So here's a man who lives in Corinth. He's going to be visiting Rome, and he says, hey, I heard Paul wrote a letter to you guys too. I want to write that out. Do you mind if I copy it when I get there? Sure, that's no problem. This happened, I'm sure, dozens and dozens of times over. And those manuscripts would have lasted as much as 80, 90 years, but would have fallen apart from all these copies being made. So we don't have the originals, they disappeared, and all the copies that we have disagree with each other at some point. Sometimes it's quite a few disagreements, but we have hundreds of thousands of textual variants among our manuscripts. So, a question to ask here is, how badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament? It's absolutely proven that they did. No two manuscripts are alike, so unless one of them is pristine, every single scribe made mistakes. So because the original manuscripts disappeared, and because no two copies agree with each other completely, We have to do textual criticism. We can't just rely on one. It's imperfect. So scholars have to reconstruct it on that basis. But when you look at the number of textual variants, and there's hundreds of thousands of them, as Bart Ehrman likes to say, there are more textual variants than there are words in the original New Testament. That's actually an understatement. But you have to not just look at the number of variants, you have to look at the nature of these variants. And the best estimates are that at least 99.8% of them affect nothing. Most are spelling differences. There's different ways to spell John. There's different ways to spell Mary. They're not going to affect anything. But the 1/5 of 1% that do affect things are the ones that scholars talk about and disagree over on a number of these issues. But the bottom line is, it does not matter in some respects which New Testament you use, because no essential doctrine is jeopardized by any of these textual variants. Even Bart Ehrman, who wrote Misquoting Jesus, can say the same thing. So that's true on that end, but at the same time, we want to know what the original text said in all the details. And so the great majority of scholars have very few disagreements over these passages. For example, most scholars would say the long ending of Mark's Gospel, Mark 16, 9 through 20, is almost surely not authentic. And they still put in their Bibles typically smaller print or in brackets or footnotes.
Okay, so what he's talking about here in this clip, just to clarify, is in all of these manuscripts. Remember, we have a wealth of manuscripts, over close to 6,000 in the original Greek. There are variants in these manuscripts, like a scribal error or something like that, or a difference. But what are these differences? Skeptics will hype these up as though, well, that means we have no idea what the original said. But actually, they're just spelling differences or something like that. There are different ways to spell the name Mary or something like that. It has no impact on what was actually being said. We know it's talking about John or Mary. And here's this clip in terms of what I was talking about with the number of manuscripts.
The New Testament, if you were to compare it to the average classical work, what would we end up with? Well, the average classical Greek writer has less than 15 copies of his works still in existence. You stack them up, they're about 4 feet high. So how would that compare to the New Testament? I thought about this, about how can I express this visually? So I thought, well, the average classical work, it's kind of like this podium, about 4 feet high. This is actually a photograph of this very podium. And then the New Testament, what could I use to illustrate that? Well, how about the Empire State Building? And I have to add, in New York City, to those of you who are, I guess, USD students, is that right? Because you don't know where it is, but anyway. But that's not to scale. Now I'm going to show you this to scale. Here's the podium. Okay, now you can see it. See that dot? It's about a pixel. It's 4 feet tall. And here's the Empire State Building, 1,454 feet tall. But it's not just one Empire State Building. So you have the average classical author. He's got manuscripts that stack up to one podium. The New Testament, we're just talking about the Greek and other versions, just like we are for the classical authors. And we're not talking about the Church Fathers quotations. I have no idea how to quantify that. It's not just one Empire State Building. It's 4.5.
So that's he's making that point about the quantity of manuscripts we have compared to other ancient works. The number of New Testament manuscripts is the equivalent in size of 4 Empire State Buildings, because we have 25,000 manuscripts versus 12 for, Homer or Aristotle or something like that. So that's the comparison that he's giving us. And that's great, because, that means if somebody makes a mistake in one manuscript, well, we have 24,900 others that didn't make that same mistake. So on that basis, we know what the original said with a 99.8% degree of confidence. And even atheists will admit that. So in a nutshell, what that means is that we are extremely confident, proven beyond all reasonable doubt, that we know what the originals actually said even though we only possess manuscripts. Does that make sense to everybody, or do you guys have any questions? Because I know this one is a bit of a technical objection. No? Okay. Okay, cool. So let's move on from this to another objection that's a little bit easier to understand. So this is the second negative evidence that a resurrection skeptic might bring to disprove the resurrection hypothesis. And they'll say, well, look, let's pretend you do know what the original New Testament document said, and let's even assume that you've done your work and proved that they reflect eyewitness testimony. I agree that John wrote John and he was an eyewitness. But they'll say that's still not good enough because eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. We can't rely on that eyewitness testimony to give us truth because, in certain court cases, there have been certain studies where eyewitnesses are horrible. They get details wrong all the time. And they'll point to an example of the sinking of the Titanic. Well, the newspapers at the time, half of the people that were eyewitnesses, they were on the ship, they saw it sink, and they were on a lifeboat at the time. Half said that the ship broke in half as it sank. The other half said, no, it sank in one piece without splitting in two. We obviously now know today that it did break in half, and that but half the eyewitnesses just got it wrong. So this is the second objection. They'll say, well, we know that eyewitnesses can't be trusted because they get things wrong at times. So even if I grant the Christian that this reflects eyewitness testimony, maybe they just misremembered something and got the details wrong. How would you guys respond to a skeptic who said something like that?
Well, do you think then it's only because of the memory that they had memory loss?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's the issue with memory.
Oh.
In the New Testament, the various Gospels all have little differences, but the main thrust of it is the same.
The essential gist.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so yeah, we tend to be really good at remembering the essential gist of things, even if we get certain minor details wrong. Like, we can't remember the color of the guy's shoelaces or something like that, but we remember, what happened. He was wearing a black shirt or something like that. Okay, well, so here's the response. So it is true that there are certain cases that prove that eyewitness testimony can be unreliable in certain circumstances. But there have been psychological studies which prove that there are other circumstances in which eyewitness testimony and memory is extremely reliable. And what they found, psychologists of memory, this is a specific subfield, and they've done intensive studies to discern when eyewitness memory can be relied upon versus not relied upon. And all of the examples the skeptics appeal to are totally irrelevant and stuff like that because they're not applicable to the memories we have with the Gospels. So, for example, eyewitness memories are reliable when a few conditions are met. So, number one, if the event is very significant to the person remembering it, and even beyond that, if they are participating in the event themselves, we have a far better memory than if we're just a passive person not taking part in the event, and it's something we just don't care about. Okay, it goes in one ear and out the other because I don't care about it. I'm not going to remember that. But when it is something significant, you really remember that, right? So that's one condition. The second condition is that our memories are very reliable when we recall the event extremely soon after the event itself. So we express it in words, what happened or something like that. We remember it immediately instead of forgetting about it and then coming back to it a week later or something like that. Our memories really, we tend to forget things just within a few hours. So as long as we recall the events within a few hours, then our memory can be trusted. Also, if the event is recalled in a social environment where there are other eyewitnesses present who can correct us, if we remember a minor detail wrong and they'll say, oh no, actually, that's not true. This happened. Then oh yeah, you're right. Yeah. And then this and this. So that would improve the memory's reliability. Also, if the event is recalled repeatedly over and over again, that cements it in our memory where we will never forget. We're always going to be reliable. So those are 4 or 5 conditions that psychologists of memory say result in reliable memories. And guess what? All of these criteria are met in the case of the eyewitness testimony preserved in the Bible, in the Gospels, and in Paul's letters, and in the pre-New Testament sources. So on that front, we can believe that the eyewitness memories are reliable. And I just want to play a clip by Dr. Richard Bauckham, who has conducted research into this aspect, and he kind of goes over this. So, all right, so that's until 1456 at the 10-minute mark. Okay.
This is where eyewitnesses are much more reliable, is where they are people actually involved in the event in some way, emotionally affected by the event, an event that was really important to them. And those are the kinds of events people do remember well.
Yes.
Events in which they were personally involved, which were important to them.
I'm likely to remember my wedding better than that 10th wedding I went to in that particular year, for instance.
Yeah. And, I mean, there are, you see, what I tried to do in my book, focusing on the kind of evidence that was important for me was eyewitness testimony to personally experienced events. I probably neglected memories of the sayings of Jesus, because I think that's a quite different sort of memory. That's semantic memory. It's memory for information rather than memory for events that happen to you. But in the case of events that happen to you, there's been a lot of psychological research, and they actually do tell you the factors that make for a well-remembered event and the factors that enable long-term memory. And importance to the person experiencing it, emotional involvement. The event is unusual. That also matters. If you got married every day, you wouldn't remember it. Your 1 or 2 weddings you remember. Unusual events you remember. But then also the conditions. Most forgetting, I think Bart says this in his book, most forgetting actually occurs very quickly. Most of what we forget in the first few hours or a couple of days. The memories that survive that initial period of forgetting are much more likely to stick. And they are likely to stick if we are frequently rehearsing them.
Right.
And what you can tell probably from people's own experience is very soon after you remember it, if it's an event you tell people about, very soon it acquires a sort of standard form in your memory. You always tell the story like that.
Yes.
And that, in fact, ensures that it does stay much the same.
I can think in my example of the way I met my wife, because you inevitably end up telling that story a lot at parties and places like that. I have a sort of a standard sort of series of events that have kind of solidified in my mind. Now, if I went back to the day, I'm sure there's all kinds of other little details that I have completely forgotten about. But it's these sort of I've got a kind of a timeline in my mind of the central events of that particular evening, let's say. So it's that sort of idea, is it, that these are the kind of...
Yes, and the other very important thing, I think, is that people remember the gist of an event much better than the details. They remember the narrative core, in other words. Yes. Somebody said, if someone's hit by a car, they may well forget the colour of the car the day of the week, but they don't forget that they were hit by a car rather than, say, falling off a mountain. That the central core of the memory is very persistent. The details may vary, and memory distortion, which does happen, of course, quite often. But memory distortion tends to happen with the details.
Well, we need to come back to Bart, but
okay, so
just to bring that together, is it your view that the stories from the Gospels and the way what we have there coheres with this more reliable sort of form of memory, because it was significant events quickly that started to be rehearsed and told again and again, and so it's stuck in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, these events were told because the people who experienced them found them very significant for themselves. They're personally important events for the people telling them, and of course they went on telling them. If Mark really is Peter's memoirs, Peter went on telling these stories for decades.
And Mark wouldn't be the first person Peter had told that story to.
No, of course not.
In that sense.
No, he was constantly telling people all the time. You know that.
Okay, so you can kind of see that when it comes to the resurrection, death and resurrection of Jesus, this was the essential core for the disciples, that they repeated and rehearsed and told this to people over and over again. This was the most important aspect for them. So, yeah, this part of the memory would be preserved and would be reliable. Does that make sense to everybody in terms of what the response is there? Or? Any questions at all? Or?
In number 4, the event is recalled repeatedly over and over again. Wouldn't some people remember details differently than others? You know?
Well, in terms of repeating it over and over again, so what happens, they were talking about that standard form, right? So the way our memories work, the first time you recall something, that's the way it gets locked into our head. And then you repeat that standard way over and over again. But that standard way that's why it's important with number 3, if you're doing it in a social environment with other eyewitnesses that can correct you during that initial telling, then you can reform that memory and it adopts that new standard form, right? So if I say, yeah, I remember the car was red, and then you say, well, no, actually it was red, but it had green stripes on it. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. It was red with green stripes. Then that red with green stripes becomes the standard in my memory. And if I keep repeating that story over and over again, it was red and green stripes, then it's cemented in my memory. And I'll remember that 60 years from now and get that detail correct. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So yeah, that's why. And again, look, Peter wasn't in a bubble. There were 11 other or 10 other disciples. There was James and the women who could all correct and collaborate each other's, in terms of the appearances and stuff like that. So yeah, the Gospels fit this. The resurrection appearances were in a social environment where there were multiple eyewitnesses with each other. And obviously, they were preaching the resurrection over and over again, so yeah, it's cemented in their memories. Okay. So yeah, I think the third type of negative evidence that skeptics will bring, and this is kind of a common one, is people will say that there are contradictions in the gospel accounts related to Jesus' death and resurrection. So, this is something that you guys would probably hear all the time. It's the most common skeptical claim, but they claim that, well, this constitutes evidence. There are contradictions in the Gospels about Jesus' death and resurrection. Therefore, the resurrection can't be true. It can't be reliable. How would you guys respond to like that sort of claim?
Can you say that again?
So if a skeptic comes to you and says, well, I could never believe in the resurrection because if I look at the 4 Gospels, there are differences, there are contradictions in the accounts, so I can't rely upon it to believe in the resurrection.
But they may be
telling what they saw.
Yeah.
Each of them was telling what they saw, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't resurrected.
Yeah.
And as you say that, I'm thinking of the plane crash that they had at Pearson, and they're interviewing people who were on the plane. Everybody's giving a different version, but the plane did crash. It's only that they saw it, everybody saw it a different way.
Yeah.
So there shouldn't be any contradiction.
But you see,
Absolutely.
also, people are different
Exactly.
on how people are brought up. All right, it may be in from growing up, going to school. When you went to school, your teacher taught you one thing. When you went to another school, it's the same thing they're talking about, but just it's in a different way, a different way of bringing it to you. But it's the same thing. So what Peter saw and what James saw, it's the same thing, but their way of repeating it and saying what happened could be different. Their view of how looking at it may be different.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all the gospel, right? The four gospels speak of the same thing, but they all wrote different. They wrote differently from their heart. Yeah.
Exactly.
The same like report, like any reporter that reported news, you never find that they say the identical thing, but still focus on the main thing.
Yes.
That essential jest. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Both great responses. And as you'll see, that this is I've kind of, in terms of the Christian response, I've broken it into 3 different strategies that a Christian can respond to this objection. So strategy 1, I think, is what one of you guys said first, is, well, look, you can even affirm that there are these differences and even accept that there's contradictions, just for the sake of argument, for the skeptic.
Yeah.
But okay, great. So that would deny something like biblical inerrancy, but that doesn't deny that the resurrection, the event itself, actually
didn't happen.
So this is the first strategy. You can downplay the significance. You can admit to the skeptic and say, great, you know what? I'm going to grant for the sake of argument that there are contradictions, but so what? That doesn't mean the resurrection didn't happen, right? Because I mean, I pointed to the example of the Titanic. There were contradictions. Did it break in half or not? But nobody denies the Titanic. Exactly. So that's the first approach. There is a second approach where you can deny that you can admit there are differences, but that doesn't mean the same thing as having contradictions, because there can be ways to harmonize these differences. And this was the second thing I think you guys mentioned, because look, people remember things differently, but that doesn't mean, so, for example, with the women at the tomb, different gospels spotlight different women based on what's important to their categories. But that isn't necessarily a contradiction, because John mentions Mary Magdalene is there, and maybe Luke says it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna.
Yeah, the Mary. Other women, yeah.
Yeah, but that can be harmonized, because John, it's not like John is saying, well, it was only Mary Magdalene. No, he just mentions that Mary Magdalene was there, but he doesn't deny and say, but nobody else was there. So that's the second strategy, is these accounts can be harmonized. So there's a difference because certain things stick out to different people as they record the story, but that doesn't necessarily entail a contradiction. And then there's strategy 3, which may be new to some of you guys, but so once again, you deny that there are contradictions, but you don't appeal to a literal harmonization. Instead, you can appeal to an ancient literary device. And this is a tactic employed by scholars like Dr. Mike Licona. And he's written an entire book on gospel contradictions. And he said, well, look, remember when we looked at the biblical sources, we had that question of genre. And the Gospels, for example, are the ancient Greco-Roman biography or history genre. And with that, there are certain rhetorical or literary devices that they would use that can account for these differences without that entailing that they're contradictions. So here's just a 3-minute clip of Mike Licona explaining these strategies. Go over that.
Loves the Lord, and I just can't tell you how blessed I am to have you on our program today.
Well, thanks, Bob. Great to be back with you.
I know that you play with this idea, if you were in a taxi cab, how would you respond? Well, I'd like to kind of throw that your way. If you were in a taxi cab and somebody was to say the Gospels have contradictions in them, how would you answer that question?
I'd say there are three essential issues in coming to grips with these differences, these tensions in the Gospels. The first one has to do with the ability to distinguish between a difference and a contradiction. A contradiction would be something like when the Titanic sank, there were survivors who said that the Titanic broke in half and then sank, and then other survivors said, no, it went down intact. That is a contradiction. There's no way of reconciling that. A difference would be something such as, I come home and my wife said, you wouldn't believe this, an hour ago a guy shows up at the door and from Publishers Clearinghouse and he gives me a check for $15 million. But then an hour later she's talking to her mom and says, you wouldn't believe this, but a little while ago, two guys show up at my door. One gave me this check for $15 million, the other's videotaping the thing saying I'm going to be on television. That's a difference. It's not a contradiction. One contained more information, the other was not exhaustive. Many of the differences we have, or alleged contradictions in the Gospels, are actually differences and not contradictions. A second issue that we would look at is to understand the genre or literary type of the Gospels, because they're according to Greco-Roman biography, and just like in much of today's literature, there were certain literary liberties that were allowed. Time compression, lack of precision when it came to minor chronological details, and such as the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness. Matthew and Luke, one of them inverts the second and third. We wouldn't regard that as a contradiction. We would say that that's a difference. It really doesn't matter the chronology, something like that. Again, most of them can be looked at as understanding the genre, the literary type of the Gospels, rather than contradictions. And then the third point I would make is the importance of differences, and that is this. I don't see any direct contradictions in the Gospels, but let's just suppose for a moment that there were. That doesn't mean that the Gospels are unreliable. It may force us to revise some of our views of inerrancy, but it wouldn't mean that they're historically unreliable. No more than the fact that eyewitnesses, survivors of the Titanic, contradicted on whether she broke in two, nullifies the story that the Titanic sank. So putting this all in perspective, we see that this really doesn't at all call into question the historical reliability of the Gospels.
Right. So, yeah, you can see that kind of reinforces the points that we were giving in response to the fact that they claim there are gospel contradictions. So, yeah, I gave some examples and stuff like that, but I guess I'll just save some time. Yeah, I guess I'll leave that in the slides for you guys unless we have time at the end. But I want to move on to the fourth and final negative evidence. Oh, sorry.
Dale, before we move on, is it fair then to say, write out that there are no contradictions in the Bible? There are differences of how the writers have written, but should we not just say there are no contradictions in the Bible?
Yeah, I think that's a fair response, basically, given the data. Because remember, this is a negative evidence. So what that means is it's the skeptic who bears the burden of proof. They're the one making a claim here. Unlike what we were doing in previous weeks, where we were outlining a positive case where the Christian had the burden of proof, it's now the skeptic who has the burden of proof. If you're going to claim there's an actual contradiction, then you have to prove that it's a contradiction. They have to prove that it's not possible to harmonize it, or that it's not possible that there's an ancient literary device which can account for these things without it entailing a contradiction. So the onus of proof is on the skeptic with these claims. They have to prove it's a contradiction and not just a difference that is explainable.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah. And it depends on some scholars. Mike Licona is a biblical inerrantist and stuff like that, and he believes in biblical inerrancy. Whereas somebody like Dr. Lydia McGrew, she believes the Bible has some errors in it, some minor errors in secondary details and stuff.
Okay.
So,
yeah. No, okay.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions on that question, or?
Lady you mentioned, where did she get her ideas from?
Dr. Lydia McGrew?
Yes.
I think, well, I think she's very much against strategy three. So she's written an entire book against Mike Lacona's work, saying that she doesn't believe in using ancient literary devices. She believes in only these two strategies and says so for 9 things out of 10, she would agree that there aren't contradictions. She would say there's a harmonization, there are differences in the text and stuff like that, but those aren't contradictions. But there are a couple of things where and I can't remember an example offhand, where she just says, yep, I don't believe in biblical inerrancy. I think this is an actual contradiction or something like that. Yeah.
Is she a Christian?
Sorry?
Does she believe in God?
Oh yeah, she's a full saved, I would argue she's a full saved Christian, very conservative as well. That's why it's kind of surprising when I found out she didn't believe in biblical inerrancy, because I thought for sure she did, but yeah,
just one point here. If she read 2 Timothy 3:16, how would she recognize that and reconcile it?
The word of God is quick and powerful. 3:16. God breathed.
All scripture.
Yeah.
I'll just read it. All scripture is breathed out by God, and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. And that's what I read.
By inspiration.
I don't know how she personally would respond, but I think she might respond by saying, well, look what you just said, that the Bible is inerrant for certain purposes, right? For how to live a righteous life, for how to, for profitable doctrine and stuff like that. And on that front, she would agree the Bible is inerrant. She would just say, but there are certain secondary details where they contradict. Was it three or was it 400 or 500 horses in the stables? Or like I think that's how she would respond, is like there can be minor errors, but there can't be errors in doctrines or how, more ethics and how to live a proper righteous life. Yeah, but if you want, I can actually.
But I think what Brother Trevor is saying here, it's God breathed. Yes. All scripture is God breathed. Period.
Gotcha. It's inspired.
That is the top part. You could go on and say about what the scriptures are for, but the very beginning of the verse, it's God breathed. God given.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she can't dispute that one. She explained that one, then she wouldn't believe in God.
Yeah, exactly. And I think she does affirm kind of thing. And I can just play a clip of her. So this is her addressing one of the contradictions. So this is basically skeptics kind of say, where did Jesus appear? Because the Gospel of Mark and Matthew appear to contradict Luke and John. What did Jesus first appear to the disciples in Galilee, or did they first appear in Jerusalem? And here's Lydia McGrew giving her answer, and very much in an inerrant sense. So let me just show that so you can see how here she is, Dr. Lydia McGrew.
You have other reason to trust them. Okay. Number 3, Galilee versus Jerusalem. The way I view it is, look at Acts 1. Now, I think probably David and I would agree that Acts and Luke are written by the same person. I don't think that's terribly controversial. I suspect that Luke got into a hurry at the end of Luke 24. Luke's about the length of a scroll. He could have been running out of scroll. He could have been trying to catch a boat to send it to Theophilus or whatever. And I think when he came to write Acts, he realized that he had been very rushed there. You can compare Acts 1:4 to Luke 24:49, they look like the same saying of Jesus when he tells the disciples to stay in Jerusalem until the Holy Spirit comes from heaven. But in Acts 1, he's very careful to state prior to that Jesus had already been with them for 40 days. And I think he said to himself, I could have given the impression accidentally that all happened on the same day because I was writing in this rushed manner at the end. I want to clarify now in this kind of conscientious way that Jesus was with them for a much longer time. Now, whether or not Luke had specifically heard about their, meeting Jesus sometimes in Galilee and that it was specifically in Galilee, the fact remains that 40 days is plenty of time for them to have the appearances in John, as it's told, one on Easter Sunday, one a week later. Then they go, of course, Feast of Unleavened Bread is over by this time, natural time. They go to Galilee. They meet Jesus there by the seashore. And then Matthew tells of a time when they meet Jesus in Galilee on a mountain. And then they can come back because Luke says that, Jesus led them out toward the Mount of Olives. Jesus wanted them to be in Jerusalem for the coming of the Holy Spirit. So in the course of the 40 days, he's like, okay, time to go back to Jerusalem. I don't see anything implausible about that. And I think we are actually seeing Luke's conscientiousness in clarifying the length of time he was with them.
Okay, so what I'm hoping you'll get from this, so she's answering this skeptic, David Campbell Cook, and one of the contradictions he alleges is this issue of where Jesus appeared. Was it Galilee or Jerusalem? And as you can see, she's adopting an inerrantist harmonization. Strategy 2 is her approach on that one, right? She's saying there's a way to harmonize those details. So they're all literally true. There is no contradiction. They're just differences. So yeah. So even though there are a couple areas where she's an errantist about the Bible, I would say eight times out of 10, she would agree with inerrantists and say, no, there's no contradiction here or something like that. But yeah, it's up to you with these strategies and stuff, what's acceptable and not. Okay, so looking at the final negative evidence, this is another common evidence that skeptics give that says does disprove that the resurrection hypothesis is true. And it's basically an appeal to a very famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, atheist philosopher named David Hume. Just out of curiosity, have any of you guys ever heard of David Hume before in any of your talks with a skeptic or something?
No.
Okay. Yeah, so Richard Dawkins loves this guy. So all the modern atheists, basically they're copying David Hume. And way back in the 1700s, he made an argument against miracles. And he specifically highlighted the resurrection of Jesus because he was a Scottish philosopher. So Christianity was the religion he knew and stuff, right? But he basically argued on two fronts. So he argued, number one, miracles are in principle highly unlikely or even impossible because they violate the uniformity of the laws of nature. So that was his first argument. And secondly, he said, and even if a miracle did occur, no one is rational in believing in a miracle like the resurrection because the testimonial evidence for one is so bad. And he gives 4 reasons why he thinks eyewitness testimony can't be relied upon in the case of miracles. He says the actual witnesses are not good enough in character. They're not credible or honest. Humans have a motivational factor to lie. They're motivated to lie about miracle claims. And he says miracle claims only take place in quote unquote ignorant and barbarous nations. So, yep, Hume was in the 1700s. He was a Scottish atheist philosopher. There's no way around it. He was a racist pig. He thought miracle claims only happen in those backwards nations. They never happen in, white civilized culture and stuff. And then fourthly, he says, and there are contradicting religious miracle stories, so they can't be all true. None of them can be true because they all contradict each other. What's true? Did the Buddha get a rainbow body, or did Jesus rise from the dead? Uh, so yeah, how would you guys kind of respond to David Hume and his modern skeptical counterparts here? If somebody objected to miracles in this way,
he's a racist pig.
A plus.
Oh dear.
And
Also
anybody else?
ignorant.
Yeah, he was ignorant about a lot of things.
Yeah, because he's making statement. Remember, he obviously doesn't believe in God. God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. So if he stops where he started, it would be all right. But he continues.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this is one of the major, basically all modern philosophers laugh at David Hume today, and they call it Hume's abject failure, because one of the main criticisms is he just assumes that atheism is true. He just assumes in his argument that God doesn't exist. So, yeah, that's begging the question. You can't do that, right? So yeah, that's what I say here. Firstly, Hume was an atheist, and his argument here just assumes that theism is false, whereby theism is the notion of a God who is transcendent to nature. He's the creator of the laws of nature. It's not like God is constrained by the law of gravity or something like that, right? And it comes down to Hume assumed that the laws of nature were prescriptive. They were basically the gods that dictate everybody, including what God can't do. And they had this notion of laws of nature in the 1700s. It was called the Newtonian world machine. So they saw the laws of nature as kind of like the laws of legal laws today, where there can be you can't violate the law or something like that. And they saw that the universe kind of worked like a machine. Maybe at best, the machine was set up, and that's how it works. There can't be any outside input from a mechanic who can go into the machine and change things up or something like that. But unfortunately, modern science, since the 20th century, has really destroyed this notion of the universe working like a machine. We had the discovery of relativity theory and also quantum physics, which really upended this understanding. And now we understand the laws of nature, they're not prescriptive. It's not like they are things that exist and then prescribe how God or how the universe can operate. No, they're just descriptions. The laws of nature are mathematical descriptions of how the universe normally operates. So they're descriptive, not prescriptive. And if that's the case, then somebody from the outside, like God, who's transcendent to the universe, can input an event into the system. And then the law, things in the universe will respond in whatever way, according to the laws of nature. So for example, with the virgin birth, really that's the virgin conception. God inputs a miracle into the system with the virgin conception, but then the laws of nature take over and describe what usually happens. Mary had a normal pregnancy, and she had a normal natural birth of Jesus afterwards. So go ahead. I just want to play this clip from Dr. John Lennox. He is an Oxford mathematician and scientist describing this. So I just want to play the first couple minutes of that for you guys. Okay.
Now, the second objection is that now that we know the laws of nature, miracles are impossible. But that involves a further fallacy. Suppose I put $1,000 tonight in my hotel room in Cambridge, and I put $1,000 in tomorrow night. 1 + 1 = 2, that's $2,000. And on the third day, I open the drawer and I find $500. Now, what do I say? Do I say the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of the United States have been broken? Well, you obviously got the point. But see how important it is. First of all, it's telling you that law means a different thing in both cases, in each case. Secondly, how do you know the laws of the United States have been broken? It's because you know the law of arithmetic. If you didn't know that, you wouldn't know the other. Now, you see, it's not the laws of arithmetic have been broken, but what they tell you is that somebody has put their hand into the drawer.
That's it.
That is, something has come in from outside the system because it wasn't a closed system. This is crucial. You see, I believe in the laws of nature. Indeed, God, who's responsible for them, created an orderly universe. Otherwise, as I said before, we'd never recognize an exception. But God is not a prisoner of the laws. They're not like the laws of the United States. God, who set the regularities there, can himself cause an event. Of course he can. What's to stop him doing that? You see, what Christians are claiming about the resurrection of Jesus is not that he rose by some natural processes. No, they say that he rose because God injected enormous power and energy from outside the system. Now, unless you have evidence that the system is totally causally closed, you cannot argue against the possibility.
I think you guys kind of get the point there, right? It's and that's where
do whatever you want.
Yeah. He's got a great way of explaining it and stuff like that. There is one thing too, in terms of testimony. This might be something new. There's a field called the epistemology of testimony in my own area of expertise in philosophy. And Hume basically was what's called a reductionist. So without getting into fancy terminology, basically Hume assumes that testimony is not to be believed. It's to be disbelieved unless and until you have independent reasons to believe in it. So basically, eyewitness testimony is to be assumed to be guilty or false unless and until you have independent proof that it's true. That's how David Hume argues. But most philosophers like myself today realize this is total nonsense, and we actually go for a non-reductionist or an anti-reductionist position, whereby automatically testimony is to be assumed to be innocent or to be true unless and until you have a defeater or a reason to think that it's not true. And the reason people say this is because if you think about it, this is called the principle of testimony. This is how we operate all the time, right? 9 times out of 10, when people give testimony, they tend to tell the truth, right? Think about if I meet you and I ask you your name. We don't go, you told me your name is John. I don't believe you. Can you prove it? Give me your license. I'm not going to believe you until I get your license. Or if I'm out in the street and I ask somebody for directions, they, oh yeah, I've been to Pizza. It's just up the street 2 blocks. We believe that testimony automatically. That's the default state, right? Unless and until there are reasons to disbelieve it and stuff like that. So that's where Hume is coming in. Remember, he gave those 4 arguments with respect to testimony about miracles. He said, well, we do have a defeater. We have a reason to disbelieve testimony. And why? Because he gave these 4 reasons, right? So that the actual witnesses are not good enough in character. They're not credible and they're not honest. But that really just begs the question. He's just assuming that there are no credible eyewitness testimonies. Actually, we spent the last few weeks proving that there were credible eyewitness testimonies with the early disciples. We can prove that they were sincere because they were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs. So yeah, Hume is just totally out to lunch here. He's being unreasonable in assuming that any and all witnesses are they're of a deplorable character. You can't rely on them. But also in the case of the apostles, we also have another reason to believe it, because we don't just have one witness. we have multiple independent, reliable witnesses all confirming each other. And in this case, that is a good enough reason to believe it. Now, the second reason Hume gave, he said, well, humans have a motivation to lie about miracle claims. It makes, if I claim I flew around the room, that makes me look cool, and you guys think I'm great. So I've got this automatic motivation to lie about a miracle or something like that. But unfortunately, there are provable particular cases where this motivation to lie about a miracle, it just doesn't apply. And again, that is with the case of the apostles because of the persecution that was applied to them. If anything, they were motivated not to talk about Jesus' resurrection. Their lives would have been so much better if they just listened to Caiaphas and said, stop talking about Jesus. We're going to let you go, but I command you not to talk about Jesus again. And what does Peter say? He says, well, who should I listen to? Oh, should I obey man or should I obey God? So, yeah, this is just not true. In this case, Peter had the motivation to lie and not claim the resurrection. So it's the opposite of what Hume says. Also, think about it with the case of the religious Jewish disciples. They had strong theological motivations not to lie. The Old Testament condemns lying. It's against one of the commandments in the 10 Commandments, so they had a strong motivation not to anger God and make up a lie about a resurrection or something like that. Finally, there's very good case to be made that the Jesus disciples were not mistaken or deluded. Remember, we went over the various illusion, delusion, and hallucination hypotheses, and we found out that none of them really work in the case of the disciples. So you can't say that, well, they're not credible because they were mistaken in some way either. Here's your favorite. So miracle claims only take place in ignorant and barbarous nations. So, I think the first response, you're just a racist pig, right? Obviously Hume, he was a product of his time and culture. And he basically saw his race and culture as being superior and quote unquote civilized compared to other nations where these miracle claims would abound, right? Those people are just primitive and savage. But actually, in the first place, it's just not true because there were many miracle claims, even in Scotland and England and all these other places, even to this day. So that there are miracle claims everywhere, not just in certain nations or that sort of thing. And Hume just conveniently ignored that on purpose because he would have been aware of some of these miracle claims. And in fact, David Hume's argument was borrowed from Protestants who were attacking Catholics because they saw them as very superstitious and believing in all these Eucharistic miracles and all this stuff. So believe it or not, we share some blame for Hume in that we started this notion that only primitive people like Catholics would believe in miracle claims. But, the Roman Catholics were white Europeans, just like David Hume. Also, we have very good evidence. And I mentioned Dr. Craig Keener. He's written a 2-volume book specifically on miracle healings and stuff like that. And there are literally thousands of examples that have been documented in various, places that, including Scotland, where David Hume's from. And these include medical documentation and stuff like that. So it's just patently false that miracle claims only occur in ignorant and barbarous nations. It's just not true. What about this last one? They're contradicting miracle claims, right? Because there are miracle claims in different religions and stuff like that. Well, in order to respond to that, there are different interpretations of the data, right? So it could be, number one, that it's true. Maybe there are actually some miracle healings that take place in other religious contexts, like some Hindus get miraculously healed or something like that, or atheists might get healed and stuff like that at times. But that doesn't mean that because a miracle healing takes place, that's God endorsing their religions, because there are different types of miracles, right? So there are religion authenticating miracles, something that vindicates a religious claim. That's what the resurrection claims to be, right? You know, Paul says our faith is false if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. But sometimes there are also miracles of compassion, right? So when Jesus felt compassion and he healed certain people, that wasn't necessarily him or God authenticating the false beliefs that they had, that the Samaritan woman had or something like that. No, he still was teaching the truth, but he would heal out of compassion. So that's what I need. That's what I'm trying to pin down, is that, you know, God can do miracles for different reasons, other than endorsing their religious beliefs. Also, I would say in terms of the evidence, there's very good reason to discount the testimonies of miracles based on the evidence of other religions. And I spent 8 years studying the miracle claims of other religions. They don't hold a candle to what is there with Christianity. Christianity is unique in terms of having sufficient evidence to prove its claims about a miracle or the resurrection in particular. Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, the evidence is very weak, and it's not sufficient to prove that a miracle actually took place. And my friend, Dr. Gary Habermas, he's actually written, I'll just show it to you, an entire book for free on the uniqueness of Jesus Christ, based on his miracle claims compared to all the other world's religions. Hopefully that will pop up. So yeah, when Suli sends you my slides, you can click on the link, and it's called The Uniqueness of Jesus Christ Among the Major World Religions. You can see it's night and day. Christianity truly is unique in terms of... Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's truly unique in terms of the evidence we have for Christianity. No other religion has quality evidence like that. All right, so... Okay. So yeah, okay. So yeah, I just want to, in terms of David Hume, I just want to play a couple clips. Okay, 8:10. So I'll just play this clip from Craig Keener, answering David Hume. And Craig Keener was a former atheist who became a Christian based on the evidence for miracles.
I think for many of us who have not experienced miracles or know someone who's experienced a miracle, it seems foreign. And our society relies so heavily on modern science. What would you say to skeptics who fall in line with David Hume and say they just don't exist?
I would say that when you're dealing with any other kind of subject, you pay attention to what reliable eyewitnesses say. If you hold your philosophic premise so tightly because you haven't experienced it, that you doubt everybody else has experienced it, if you're willing to call hundreds of millions of people liars to defend your philosophic premise, wouldn't it be worth rethinking whether your philosophic presupposition might be open to reconsideration?
That's a good point.
I was an atheist before my conversion, so I have some sympathy for the skeptical approach.
Okay.
And I struggled with it some. Even though I had seen some miracles, even though I had experienced some miracles, I always thought, well, you can come up with some other explanation if you have to. And ultimately, people can always come up with some other explanation. Sometimes people actually do come up with an explanation. They say, well, we don't have any naturalistic explanation for this now, but maybe we will someday, and that's good enough for them. But unless you hold inflexibly to such a presupposition, is that really naturally where the evidence would lead you? If a person is open-minded and comes to this open-mindedly, we have so many eyewitness accounts. it seems to me that we really need to consider some of these can be explained in other ways. But when you have multiple raisings from the dead, in my own circle, I mean, if it were just a coincidence, say a 1 in 10,000 coincidence, how do you explain the coincidence of me having 10 people in my own immediate circle who are eyewitnesses of that?
It gets hard to ignore at that point.
It gets very hard.
So that's Craig Keener. And do you guys want to see a 7-minute clip talking about an example of someone who was raised from the dead in the modern world, based on a prayer to Jesus, or do you guys prefer to kind of wrap up? I'll let you guys decide.
Go ahead. Good.
Play it?
Yeah.
Then show it.
All right, cool. So this is a friend of mine named Caleb Jackson, who's also writing a book on modern miracles within a Christian context. So praying to Jesus and they get miraculously healed, but today, at this time. And here he's going to give an account of a modern day resurrection.
Dramatic as we go on, by the way. So next one is case 3, do people still raise from the dead? Well, I think in one case we have a pretty good example. Now, this is not just someone who had a heart attack or was believed to be dead for 40 minutes or so and then happened to be revived back. Those do happen, but you could always say people misdiagnose death. So the question is, do we have a case where there was someone who was pretty much irrefutably dead to where it would be very hard to sincerely be mistaken about that? And that's one of the ones that I think is interesting. Craig Keener talked about this case a little bit, but I think he spends like half a paragraph in his scholarly book on this. And so I wanted to go really into depth in it and look at the initial sources. So this is Daniel Ekechukwu, who was in Nigeria at the time. This was back in 2001. So on November 30th, 2001, Daniel gets into a car accident with some of his family members in the car at the time. And I think there's a slight distinction between whether or not his head went through the windshield or whether he had just had internal hemorrhaging from banging on the steering wheel. Some of the sources differ on those secondary details, but then again, so do most car accident stories, so that's not that surprising. So anyway, he's severely injured, so they take him to the hospital, and they kind of go around to different hospitals. He wants to go to this particular one, but there's closer ones, but he gets turned down, and there's a whole long process. But he dies on the way in the ambulance, or at least is assumed dead, and by the time they get to the last clinic at St. Eunice's, he's pronounced dead at 11:30 p.m. that night. And the death certificate is signed, which I have pictured here. And the doctor is Jose Anabunwa, signed there. So Daniel's died. And then at that night, so then they take the body to the mortuary. So at this point, they take the corpse to the mortuary at Ekeduru General Hospital.
If starting a side hustle is something that interests you, make sure you continue watching. If not, skip this video. What's going on, my name?
Yep. Apologize if I'm butchering that pronunciation. At about 1 a.m. or so that Saturday. And so the mortician at the time, Darlington Manu, takes the corpse and he begins to do the pre-embalming process. So in Nigeria, they don't take the organs out of the corpses when they embalm them. So he gets the embalming fluid and he injects it into the fingers and he injects it into the toes. He's about to go and cut open the thigh and put the rest of the embalming fluid in, which is typically what you do. You drain the blood. And at this point, he stops because he feels a strong kind of electric force that he almost says pushes him back. And this freaks him out. Now, Darlington was not a Christian at the time, but he did believe in this was pretty common belief in Nigeria, at least at that time, of like occultism and witchcraft and kind of spiritism. And so he was concerned that Daniel might have been one of these people, that there was some evil force behind it. And so he puts the body to the side and puts it in the cooler for later on. But as the hours go by, a little bit later, he comes back and he, according to Darlington, says that he saw weird lights coming from it and heard what he thought was the voice of some kind of singing choir. And it really freaked him out. So he goes and doesn't end up finishing the embalming process. But at the point, the corpse is clearly suffering from rigor mortis and has the fluid inside of it. So at this point, meanwhile, Daniel's wife, I believe it's Nika, is how you say it, Nika, she's mourning the loss of her husband, but she still has faith in God. And so she's reading through her Bible, and the one verse that sticks out to her is Hebrews 11:35, which says, women receive back their dead by resurrection. Now, in context, that's talking about the Old Testament saints, but that to Nika was she thought that meant God was going to raise him from the dead. So she has a dream in which she sees Jesus and Daniel appear to her, and Daniel tells her that he's going to be raised from the dead that morning. And so Ineka goes that Saturday and takes the body and dresses up in the funeral clothes, the white, as we saw in the previous picture, and does that. And the picture down here is the coffin that they put it in. I don't believe it was a sealed coffin. I think they either kept the lid off or it wasn't sealed, completely closed. And so that morning on Sunday, December 2nd, Naneka and some other local pastors of hers go and take the corpse to a local church that's hosting Reinhard Bonnke. Now, Bonnke's a pretty well-known evangelist in Africa at that time. I believe he's deceased now, but he's a German evangelist. And the funny thing is Bonnke didn't even know that this was going on at the time. So Bonnke is giving the sermon, and while he's doing this outside the church, Naneka and the others are trying to take the body inside the church. The authorities won't let them do that, partly because they were concerned that the body they were worried that there were bombs in it because terrorism was a big threat at this point, and they also just didn't want a body in the church. And so eventually they're able to take it into the basement, not the main entrance. So Reinhard finishes up his sermon and leaves. He's not even aware that this is going on at the time. So after he leaves, they start taking the body, they place it onto the slab. They can feel the rigor mortis of the body to where it's extremely stiff at this point. So they unbutton it and they start to pray to God for, I believe, several hours. So they got there about 1 and they start to pray for it for about 2 hours. So I think they're starting to massage it as well and pray that this would happen. So color starts to come back to the body at this point, and you see color running through it, and eventually there's even some breath movement, some very faint moving up and down in the chest. And as they're doing this for a few hours, it becomes more and more distinct. And so naturally, the people who are kind of hanging around the church hear word of this, that, oh my gosh, there's a guy being raised from the dead in the basement. And so they come down and see this. And I think some of them pull out some camcorders and so forth. So at this point, Daniel eventually wakes up fairly gradually. He's kind of in a dazed state. And so they give him some water, some food. He was very thirsty, and start to fan him. And so he talks about how he had seen hell and heaven, and kind of gives a standard NDE description of seeing angels and Jesus and heaven and hell and so forth and that. And everyone there was convinced it was a miracle. And people who were hugging him noted that he still smelled of the embalming fluid. They actually held their noses at some points because they could still smell it within his veins at that point. And so there's a couple of pictures here. So this is the pictures of this is some colored pictures of the first one of the initial corpse. I believe this was on Saturday, maybe Sunday morning when they took it after the embalming process. So you can see it's pretty rigid and looks like it's embalmed. It's not just, a guy lying in a casket. And so when you can contrast this with how the body started to look after it was being prayed for, when the color of life comes back to it, you can see a pretty stark contrast. I shouldn't have to point that out. So this is when Daniel's starting to move his head and they're trying to get him to breathe. And the picture on the right is when his chest starts to move up and down at this point. And this is out shortly after about 5 p.m. when he was raised again. He's had to sit down. Guy on the right here is fanning him a little bit, but they give him some water and he's just kind of, he's not very talkative initially, but he comes out of it and he ends up being perfectly fine. No brain damage, nothing like that. And he ends up making a full recovery and staying, I believe he's still a pastor this day as far as I know, but I know he lived for several years after that.
Okay. So again, so this is just one example that Caleb Jackson's documented and that sort of thing. Again, I don't know personally. I haven't looked into the details of this myself, so I don't know whether I believe this or not. But the point that I wanted to show it to you guys for is, number one, there are plausible claims even in the modern day that could be true, and these ones even come with medical documentation from secular medical doctors, right? So he shows. Oh no.
I like the word claim.
You like the word claim, yeah. So again, I'm not necessarily endorsing these myself because I haven't looked into it, but medical documentation from again, Caleb actually looked into this is a secular medical doctor who has written on the medical documentation. The patient brought in dead about 11:30 p.m. Chest, no chest movements, no breath, no pulse, heart.
No heart songs.
No heart sounds.
Eyes dilated and fixed.
gotcha, demise and stuff like that. So yeah, so the point against Hume here is that you can't just assume that these are fake. You need to look into the evidence, and it will either speak for or against it and stuff. Whereas Hume is just assuming, oh, in the modern day, there's no claims among civilized people or something like that, medical doctors and stuff. So that was the main point I wanted to get across in playing that. Okay, perfect. So that does it for the final lecture in terms of the 4 negative evidences that skeptics might try to point out disproves the resurrection. As we can see, all 4 of those ultimately fail. And so we're still left with the positive case proving the resurrection that we did over the last 5 weeks there. Now, just so you know, there might next week, Suli said that you guys, if you want to come, you're going to get a bit of a test. So this will be kind of a fun. Yeah, so you guys got all the slides and stuff, right? So just kind of check over the slides to remind yourself of stuff. But what we're going to do, I'm going to play a debate on the resurrection, like certain, like the opening speeches and maybe one of the rebuttals or so. And then we're going to test your knowledge and see, okay, what were some of the sources they used? What were the facts that they used? Stuff like, stuff like that. So next week will just kind of be a way of having some fun and seeing what, if you guys learned something from the series, basically. So yeah, that's the plan.
Dale, can you tell me the difference between a miracle and a healing?
A miracle and a healing? Well, so in the cases that we're looking at, they are miraculous healings, if we're assuming they happen, right? But it's the purpose for the miracle. So God can have different purposes for doing a miracle. And I think in a lot of cases, he does miracles out of compassion rather than authenticating religion. So, God could miraculously heal a Muslim, or he's perhaps even healed atheists, but that isn't God saying, oh, yes, I'm supporting atheism. No, he's healing a person out of compassion. Whereas,
sorry, a miracle, is it an instantaneous work? And we look at healing. Healing can be a process.
Yeah. So I think Caleb Jackson, when you're studying the issues of miraculous healings, there are certain criteria that the people who like Craig Keener and Caleb Jackson have to go. And one of them is, was it an instantaneous healing versus did it take time? And if it took time, how long did it take? And is that medically, naturally plausible or not, or something like that? So in this case, in terms of the timing with that resurrection guy, he wasn't just dead for a few hours where, medical, you can come back and revive or something like that. And, people have revived naturally that way. But this guy was dead for days, apparently. And they even put
days.
Sorry.
So can we say his was a healing and not a miracle?
No, he was dead.
It was a process.
No, he was dead.
It took days for him to come back too.
No, that would have been a miracle.
That'd be a miracle, not a healing.
Yeah. He
Again,
was dead. He was in a coffin.
But
if everything,
it wasn't instant.
We have some medical people here. Like I don't remember when I was studying near-death experience. Like, there's a difference between clinical death and biological death.
Right.
So, clinical death you can come back from, right? So we see that happening naturally all the time. But if somebody is saying, well, they're biologically dead, that's in Christian terms, that's separation, permanent separation of body and soul. Typically, that you don't come back from that unless you're Jesus or Lazarus or something like that, unless a miracle happens. So yeah, we need to look at the medical, facts. Like, did they experience clinical death or biological death? And if it's biological death and he came back, then I can only see that as a miracle. I don't know how that would happen naturally. Again, it depends. Are those the actual facts? Do we trust them? I'm in the same boat as you. I haven't looked into these claims on my end, so I don't know. But yeah.
Well, the question is the length of days before he came back. That's where the question is.
That's right. A miracle is instantaneous. Healing is a process. It took a while for him to come back.
Yeah, but his healing wasn't his healing. He didn't have he was breathing.
You have to think about it.
Healing, you're still alive.
No, but remember when Jesus heals the the blind man,
right?
Yeah,
it wasn't just one shot. The Bible says he brought him out of the city, and there's theological meanings to that as well. But he was healed, but it did take.
Yeah, and with this guy, I think so. He had his accident November 30th and was dead on November 30th, and then apparently he raised on December 2nd. So, Jesus was dead for 3 days or 36 hours or something like that. So
that's just a storm. Jesus is almost different.
Okay.
Different, yeah. But again, like I said, I'm not necessarily endorsing that this is true because I don't know what I believe. I need to look into it myself. So
that's questionable.
Any other questions or comments or anything? Like we're done the lectures. It's just fun next week, so and that'll be our last week.
Well, you guys look over the slides and study, because we will.
We're gonna get our certificate.
You will, a resurrection certificate,
a gold star.
Before we pray, Dale, did you? I don't know if you emphasize that the differences in the Gospels could also be a good thing.
Yeah, so I don't think I highlighted that it's a good thing, but it is, right? Because this is how we know there's not a collusion. There isn't a conspiracy of the people to get together and tell a lie. If you would you would have your story straight, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But these guys, they were independent. Remember when back in week 2, we wanted independent sources, and these differences are a way we prove that these sources are independent. So
there is a benefit in the narratives being different. And it's just like when my mom was talking about the plane crash and everybody having a different take on it. That shows that nobody sat around and talked and came up with an idea. So yeah, that's one proof that we could say that the story is true as well.
Right.
So they're not contradictions.
No,
that's difference.
And you also have to, and I think, and Dale did emphasize this, that the authors are writing from a specific perspective, and they have different emphasis that they're trying to display. So yes, one may say about Mary and one may say Mary Magdalene. It's the emphasis of what the author is trying to report. He may not give you every single detail. They may not write. It may not be culturally necessary for them to do that.
One thing with that women issue as well, one of the theories that Richard Bauckham has, and I think there's something to it, is that the reason they're mentioning different women like Joanna versus Salome and stuff like that is based on their naming witnesses, right? So Joanna was. Is it Luke that mentions Joanna was Luke's witness, or Salome was Mark's witness or Matthew's witness or something like that? Yeah. And there is some warrant to this when we get to people that are named like Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross. Richard Bauckham argues, that the reason he's named is because he became a Christian later on and he was a witness to this, and that's where. So it's a way of demarcating sources, eyewitness sources as well. That's one theory.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Good. You guys have been learning a lot. And so when the skeptics come your way, you have enough ammunition that Dale has given you as you review your slides, and you guys can be scholars within yourself.
And if you've just learned one thing tonight, you've learned David Hume was a racist pig. So you got one thing.
Dale, you could probably stop the recording now.